Hello everyone. Today I will continue sharing with you the love story of two Sam and police officer Lee. I hope you enjoy the video. Since the baby arrived, time has quietly altered the rhythm of both two Sam's and Lee's lives in ways neither of them was prepared for. For two Sam, her world gradually narrowed until it revolved entirely around the child. Every morning began with the soft sound of her baby's breathing, and every night ended with her checking every tiny movement, every turn in sleep. Old habits slowly faded into the background. She no longer paid attention to whether time passed quickly or slowly, because each hour was measured by her child's growth. Nearly all of her attention, patience, and love were devoted to the baby, as if looking away for even a moment might cause her to miss something precious. Her happiness was no longer loud or obvious. It lived in the smallest moments. A weak little grip of the hand, an unconscious coo, or the warmth of her child resting against her chest. There were days when exhaustion made her forget to eat, yet one look at her baby sleeping peacefully was enough to make every sacrifice feel worthwhile. She accepted placing herself quietly in the background, naturally and without complaint. Lee's life, however, flowed in a different direction. His work grew increasingly demanding, long shifts one after another, emergency calls arriving at any hour. The responsibility on his shoulders was heavier than before, not only because of his profession, but also because of the small family that had just begun. And yet, that very responsibility often kept him away. He left home before dawn and returned when the city was already asleep, sometimes only seeing his child through a photo two Sam sent him. Lee loved his child, that had never changed. But his love was often hidden behind his uniform, behind the sirens, behind duties that could not be postponed. There were nights when, standing alone in the break room, Lee suddenly realized how many of his child's first moments he was missing. Moments he knew would never return. Guilt crept quietly into his thoughts, even though he understood he had no other choice. Between them, the distance did not come from indifference, but from mismatched rhythms of life. Two Sam grew used to managing on her own, making decisions, holding her child through moments of weakness. Lee, meanwhile, became accustomed to trying to make up for things in silence, through brief check-in messages and hurried touches each time he came home. Even so, they both understood that the child was the thread binding them together, quietly, persistently. No matter how life changed, no matter that each of them moved to a different beat, deep down they were still oriented toward the same point. The small family they were both trying to protect, each in their own way. That day, Lee sent a message very late. Just a single short line. "I have to work overtime. I'll probably be home late." Two Sam read the message just after the baby had fallen asleep. The room was so quiet she could hear the ticking of the second hand on the wall clock. She looked at the meal she had prepared for Lee earlier that afternoon, untouched. After a moment of thought, she carefully packed it up, put on her jacket, and decided to bring it to him. Not out of obligation. She simply wanted him to eat properly, wanted him to know that no matter how busy he was, there was still someone behind him who cared. When she arrived, the lights in the duty room were still on. Through the glass window, two Sam instinctively stopped. Lee was sitting at the table, not alone as she had expected. In front of him was an open lunchbox, and beside him sat a female colleague. They were eating and chatting. Lee's expression relaxed. He even smiled faintly. At that moment, two Sam's heart faltered. It wasn't fierce jealousy nor clear suspicion. Just something very small and thin, like someone had lightly brushed against a hidden ache in her chest. She stood there for a few seconds, gripping the handle of the food bag tightly. Suddenly, the distance she had just traveled felt longer than she had imagined. But she still walked forward. Lee looked up and noticed her almost immediately. The smile on his lips disappeared. He stood up abruptly, set the lunchbox down, and hurried toward her. "Why did you come here?" Lee asked, lowering his voice in surprise. Two Sam pressed her lips together, trying to keep her tone calm. "I brought you food." Lee glanced at the bag in her hand, a flicker of awkwardness crossing his eyes. He was about to say something, but Sam gently avoided his gaze. She didn't complain or ask questions. That silence made the distance between them clearer than ever. I was going to call you, Lee said quickly, as if trying to explain. There's no need, Sam replied softly. You've already eaten. The words were light, but Lee could hear something unfinished within them. Sam placed the food bag into his hand, her movements quick and neat. I'm heading home. It's late. The baby's waiting. Without waiting for Lee to stop her, she turned and left. Her steps weren't fast, but they were firm. Lee stood there, watching her familiar figure disappear down the long corridor, an unexpected emptiness settling in his chest. On the way home, Sam didn't cry. She just felt tired from spending the whole day around the baby, tired from thinking about Lee, and tired from realizing that sometimes, no matter how hard she tried, she still couldn't step into his work world, the place where he belonged in a different way. As for Lee, when he returned to the desk, the lunchbox in front of him had already grown cold. Suddenly, the meal no longer tasted as good as before. One image kept replaying in his mind. Sam standing at the doorway silent, carrying both her care and a quiet hurt she hadn't spoken aloud. After Sam left, Lee stood in the hallway for a long time. Her footsteps had long faded, but the sense of loss remained. He went back to the desk and looked at the lunchbox. It was still warm, the lid carefully secured, clearly prepared early. He opened it but didn't eat right away. It struck him then that he had become so accustomed to the rhythm of his work that he had forgotten the feelings of the person waiting for him at home. That smile he had shared with his colleague meant nothing special. It was just a normal, polite moment. But when placed beside Sam's silent gaze, Lee suddenly felt he had done something wrong, even without meaning to. For the rest of the shift, Lee worked in a rare state of distraction. Tasks that were usually automatic felt slower. From time to time he glanced at his phone, but the screen remained silent. No messages. No calls. By the time his shift ended, it was already very late. Lee came home later than usual. The small house was darker than he expected. Only a warm yellow light spilled from the bedroom, just enough to see Sam's slippers neatly placed by the door. He stepped inside quietly, as if afraid of breaking the fragile stillness. The baby was asleep. Lee stood at the bedroom door and looked in. Sam lay turned toward the child, one hand resting lightly on the baby's back, a habit that had become second nature. Her face looked more tired than usual. Her eyes were closed, but traces of tension still lingered. Lee didn't go in right away. He sat down on a chair in the living room, took off his watch, set his phone aside. The house was so quiet he could hear his own heartbeat slowing. For the first time in a long while, work was no longer the only thing filling his thoughts. He understood why Sam was upset, though she hadn't said a word. It wasn't about the other woman. It was about the feeling of being left behind, the feeling of bringing her care all the way to his workplace only to realize she was just a small part of his busy world. Lee stood up and went into the bedroom. He sat on the edge of the bed, looking at mother and child for a long time. Then very gently he pulled the blanket up higher over the baby, his movement so careful it was as if he barely breathed. Sam stirred slightly. Lee whispered, softly enough that only he could hear, "I'm sorry." No one answered. But this time, Lee didn't rush or try to justify himself. He understood that some things couldn't be explained in a single night. Some distances required time and initiative to be bridged. He lay down beside them, keeping a small distance, not touching. Just being there was enough to calm him a little. Outside, the city was still awake. Inside that small house, another kind of silence existed. Not cold, but heavy enough for both of them to reflect on how to hold on to each other, as life continued to pull them into different rhythms. In the days that followed, Lee remained just as busy as before. Shift after shift passed. Emergency calls came without warning. He returned home late and left early. Everything became so routine that Sam no longer asked about it. She simply rearranged her life quietly around her child, gradually getting used to handling everything on her own. At first, she thought it was all just a coincidence. But then, one afternoon when she took the baby for a routine checkup, Sam saw Lee from a distance. He was walking quickly across the hospital lobby, and beside him was the same female colleague from before. They were talking about something. Lee tilted his head to listen and nodded slightly. There was no intimate gesture, yet the familiar ease between them made Sam stop short. She pulled her cap lower to cover half her face and turned in another direction. Lee didn't see her. Sam told herself she was overthinking. His job was like that. Colleagues working together was normal. But the ache in her chest didn't disappear. It stayed there quietly, seeping into her smallest thoughts. Then it happened again. One evening, Sam went out to buy things for the baby. On her way back, she spotted Lee standing in front of his unit's gate. He was smiling, a relaxed smile she hadn't seen much lately. Standing across from him was still that same female colleague. She said something and Lee laughed softly, naturally. Sam stopped her motorbike not far away. This time the feeling was no longer just a quiet ache. It was heavier, deeper. Not fierce jealousy, but the sense of being placed outside a part of the life of the person she loved. A part she couldn't step into and wasn't invited to. When she got home, Sam didn't mention it. She still asked Lee whether he had eaten, still prepared warm water for him, still reminded him to rest. But those familiar questions grew shorter, her voice flatter, no longer carrying the sense of waiting it once had. Lee noticed the change, but he thought it was simply exhaustion. He didn't know that inside Sam, every image she had accidentally witnessed was piling up, forming a hollow space she couldn't name. She began avoiding questions about Lee's work. Not because she didn't care, but because she was afraid of hearing names and stories in which she had no place. Some evenings, Sam sat by the window holding her child, watching the streetlights outside, feeling suddenly empty. She didn't think Lee was unfaithful, but she began to wonder. Was she still the person closest to him? The distance between them didn't come from arguments, but from prolonged silence. Lee was still there, still coming home, still sleeping beside mother and child. Yet something between them had shifted slightly, small enough to be hard to name, but large enough that Sam no longer dared to take another step toward him. And Lee, caught in the relentless cycle of work, still hadn't realized that every time he walked beside someone else, even unintentionally, he was leaving behind a woman who had been quietly waiting for him for far too long. Sam began to change in a very quiet way. She no longer waited up for Lee every night. She no longer left the living room light on late, no longer sat by the window listening for sounds from the street. When Lee came home, everything was already neat and quiet, as if the house had grown accustomed to living without him in its daily rhythm. Sam devoted all her time to the baby. She reorganized their belongings, sorted through clothes the baby had outgrown, wrote down vaccination dates and checkups in a separate notebook. During the rare afternoons when the baby slept deeply, instead of resting, she sat silently by the bed, staring at the small face before her, her heart heavy with thoughts she had never spoken aloud. She didn't tell Lee about the time she had seen him with his colleague, not because it didn't hurt, but because Sam understood. If she had to speak up to keep someone by her side, then perhaps that person was no longer standing very close to her. Fatigue accumulated day by day. Sleepless nights, hurried meals, holding the baby while her body trembled with exhaustion. Sam began to feel dizzy more often. Sometimes when she stood up, she had to grip the edge of the bed to keep her balance. Still, she told herself to endure just a little longer. Until one evening, when Lee hadn't come home yet. Sam was bathing the baby when her vision suddenly went dark. She managed to pull the baby close and collapsed onto the bathroom floor. Water continued to run. The baby's crying echoed in the narrow space. She called out to Lee, but her voice was so weak she could barely hear it herself. Lee came home late that night. As soon as he opened the door, he heard the baby crying in an unusual way, urgent and panicked. He rushed into the bathroom, his heart dropping. Sam was sitting against the wall, her face pale, still holding the baby tightly, but her eyes were closed. In that moment Lee was truly terrified. He carried the baby out, wrapped the child in a towel, then returned to help Sam up. She opened her eyes when he called her name, her gaze blurred with exhaustion, all strength gone. I'm fine, she whispered out of habit, trying to reassure others even as she was about to collapse. At the hospital, Sam lay still on the bed with an IV drip. Lee sat beside her, holding her hand. It was colder and thinner than he had imagined. The doctor said she was suffering from severe exhaustion, prolonged lack of sleep, her body no longer able to cope. Lee listened, his throat tightening. He looked at Sam sleeping deeply and suddenly realized it had been a long time since he had truly looked at her. He hadn't noticed the dark circles under her eyes, hadn't seen how her shoulders had grown thinner, hadn't understood how that long silence had been wearing her down bit by bit. Lee lowered his head, his forehead resting lightly against her hand. For the first time he understood clearly. Sam wasn't weak, he had simply left her alone for far too long. When Sam woke up, dawn was near. Lee was still there, having not slept at all. She looked at him, her expression strangely calm. "You should go home," she said softly. "The baby needs rest." Lee shook his head. "I'm staying." Sam was silent for a long moment, then turned her face toward the window. "I don't blame you," she said quietly. "I'm just tired." It wasn't anger. It was a very gentle letting go, yet enough to frighten Lee more than any reproach. He held her hand tighter this time, not letting go, because Lee knew that if he were any slower, once Sam recovered, she might be calm enough to leave him, quietly, without drama, without clinging, taking the baby and the silence he himself had created. Sam was discharged after 2 days. She was no longer so weak that she felt faint, but her body was still exhausted, as if she had gone through a depletion far deeper than what showed on the surface. Lee took mother and child home. On the way no one spoke. The baby slept peacefully in the back seat, breathing evenly, unaware that the adults in front carried very different thoughts. That evening, after the baby fell asleep, Sam sat at the dining table with a cup of warm water in front of her. Lee stood in the kitchen, glancing at her several times but not daring to speak first. The air in the house wasn't tense, but it was heavy enough that even a small sound could startle them both. Finally, Sam spoke. "I thought about a lot of things while I was in the hospital." Her voice was calm. No accusation, no trembling. That calmness made Lee uneasy. "I don't blame you for your work. I understand that you're busy. I understand your responsibilities." She paused slightly, as if making sure she was saying what truly mattered. "But I realized, I've been living as if it's only me and the baby." Lee turned to face her directly. "I'm tired," Sam continued. "Not tired of you, but tired of having to remind myself to keep trying every day, without knowing what I'm even trying for anymore." She placed both hands on the table, her palms trembling slightly, but her gaze steady. "If this continues, I'll gradually get used to living without you in my daily life. And by then, I'm afraid I won't have a reason to stay anymore." Lee felt his throat tighten. "I want to take the baby to stay at my mother's place for a while," Sam said softly. "Not to leave. Just, I need space to breathe so I don't keep waiting in silence." The words fell gently, but to Lee they cut sharply. He didn't interrupt. He didn't defend himself. He didn't say he had done nothing wrong. For the first time Lee truly listened, Listen to everything Sam hadn't said over all that time. That night, Lee didn't sleep. He sat alone in the living room, watching the hours pass on the clock. In his mind replayed every small moment he had missed. The baby's first roll, nights when Sam stayed awake until dawn, meals that went cold because he came home late. He finally understood it wasn't because a third person had stepped in, but because he had let work take up all the space that belonged to his family. The next morning Lee took leave. Not just half a day, but an extended period he had never thought he could give. He met with his superior, requested adjustments to his schedule, and declined non-mandatory overtime shifts. It wasn't an easy decision, but this time Lee didn't hesitate. That afternoon, when Lee came home early, Sam was rocking the baby to sleep. She looked up at the sound of the door, surprise flickering in her eyes. "You're home early?" she asked. Lee nodded. He stood there for a moment, then said slowly, "I asked to reduce my shifts. Not just for a day or two. Long term." Sam was silent. She didn't show happiness nor suspicion. She simply listened. "I know this alone isn't enough to make you change your decision," Lee continued. "But I need you to know. This time I'm not just saying it. I want to stay. I want to learn how to be a husband, a father. Not just someone who always arrives too late." He looked at her directly, his gaze steady. "If you still want to stay at your mother's for a while, I respect that. But I won't stay on the sidelines anymore. I'll come. I'll be there. I won't let you be alone again." Sam looked down at the baby. Her hand gently stroked the child's back, a familiar motion. After a long time she finally said, "I don't need you to change everything. I just need to know, when I'm tired, will you be there?" Lee nodded. "Yes." Just one word, but this time it didn't fade into silence. Outside the window dusk was falling. The evening light settled softly as if their lives, after everything, still had a chance to begin again, slower, more honest, and with no one having to carry everything alone anymore.
Xin chào mọi người, cảm ơn mọi người đã xem hết video hôm nay của mình. Chúc mọi người có một ngày mới vui vẻ, hạnh phúc và một ngày làm việc tràn đầy năng lượng. Hy vọng rằng mọi người vẫn sẽ yêu thích những câu chuyện mình chia sẻ và ủng hộ kênh cho mình để mình có động lực làm nhiều video hơn, cũng như để mọi người có những câu chuyện hay và thư giãn sau một ngày làm việc mệt mỏi. Hiện tại thì kênh của mình đã phát hành những video vào khung giờ 7 giờ tối và 7 giờ sáng. Nếu mà mọi người yêu thích thì nhớ like, share và chuông thông báo để nhận thông báo khi mình đăng video mới nhất nha. Cảm ơn mọi người đã ủng hộ kênh của mình trong thời gian vừa qua. Hy vọng sẽ được đồng hành cùng mọi người trong thời gian sắp tới. Và cảm ơn mọi người đã lắng nghe những chia sẻ của mình. Hẹn gặp lại mọi người ở trong những video tiếp theo của mình nhé.